This is the London Fintech Podcast, brought to you by your host, Mike Ballerman, bridging the worlds of suits and t-shirts, of finance and technology, bringing you insights, stories, and inspiration from the golden age of opportunity and innovation happening in London right now.
Hi, this is Mike Ballerman, and this is London Fintech Podcast, episode 115, brought to you in association with Blue Motor Finance and Smart Pension. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Vishal Marria, CEO and founder of Quantexa, to talk about financial crime. Quantexa is a big data analytics tech company focusing on driving insights from data. Like the episode on the unelected and undemocratic power of regulators with Sir Paul Tucker a couple of episodes back, this is an episode I've been waiting a long time to do. Right from the start of the podcast, guests have talked to me off-air about the problem of fraud and so forth. But naturally, no one has ever wanted to speak on record. A, to avoid drawing attention to a potentially huge negative, and B, to avoid sharing how they approach it and hence giving criminals more of an idea of which door to attack and which not. It's a complex area covering many matters, and I'm delighted to find someone to talk to us about it. Vish worked at Detica, which was acquired by BAE Systems, and most recently was an executive director at Ernst & Young. Quantexa's clients include HSBC and Shell, and amongst their strategic partners are my old friends and brand partners at Synchron. Quantexa have offices in London, Brussels, Sydney, Boston and New York. I think that's all clear, and so for once, let's have a short and sweet introduction. Plenty to talk about, so let's get on with the show. Hi Vish, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for spending the time, Mike.
So, in terms of various places I mentioned, scattered around the world from Sydney to Boston, and going back to your partners at Synchron, when Faisal was on the show, I think he spent about 110% of his life actually on an aeroplane. Do you sort of fly around all these places non-stop, or do you sort of speak to everybody on Skype these days?
Oh, well, I try Skype, and it's a great medium to communicate with clients and team. But so many times people just simply want to still see you. The culture of the organisation of being there for people is still really critical. And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, I do spend a lot of my time still on a plane in our various offices and our various clients. So yes, I am flying a lot around, which really does upset my family, to be honest.
Yes. Well, someone said to me many years ago, many decades ago in the city actually, that you can have too much business travel and too little, in which is if you're flying around all the time, it just ends up exhausting. But equally, if you then have done that, and then you have a job where for 5 years you just stay in London and go in and out, you think, it'd be quite nice to go and visit Boston again, or something like to mix it up, and your family would quite like a bit of a sort of a break from you. So there's no happy medium. And a few episodes ago, I was talking about the fact that in a world of laptops and that, in principle, this podcast should be called the UK Fintech Podcast, because fintech should be evenly spread across the country.
Correct.
In practice, it's called the London Fintech Podcast because about 99.9% of them are spread here. And in the same way, in principle, we all heard the idea a few years ago that computers and social medias and FaceTimes and Skypes and all that kind of stuff mean that you don't have to fly everywhere. But actually, just mentioning Synchron again, I remember Faisal telling me about his very large empire and the fact that there is no substitute for at least sometimes being face-to-face.
Correct.
Just tuning into the person in front of you, the whole body language and everything. It's so much higher bandwidth.
I completely agree, and we know Faisal very well, and I completely agree with that. So there's no substitute sometimes for face-to-face, in person, but it's not a scalable way. So if we've all got our own growth ambitions, I cannot be everywhere at all the time. So that's a scaling concern and issue. But, as I said, there is no substitute for certain meetings to be face-to-face.
So talking about scaling then, because obviously what you're going to end up with is, going back to your 5 or 15 or 55, whatever it is by then, offices is clearly you'll get to the stage where you've got people who kind of run that almost autonomously. You almost become an umbrella company at some point in time,
yeah.
and you just need to sort of see these people now and then. But I think one of the things that sort of struck me, thinking that you formed this company relatively recently, is talking of scaling. You've scaled extremely rapidly already. I mean, you've just been going, a couple of years or so, and you've already got 5 offices. So how on earth has that happened so fast?
You're absolutely right, Mike. And so we've been running for 2.5 years. So last week we celebrated our 110th employee globally. As you say, we've got all of those offices. We've put on a few more recently. So we've got a lovely office in Toronto, a lovely office in Singapore. So we are growing rapidly. And, I would say it's quite simple in the sense of growth. When you look at growth, one thing that's been really critical for me is focus. Focus what's important, focus what's right for the market, focus what's right for your clients, focus what's right for your people, and focus what's right for your investors. They are 3 or 4 key stakeholders I have every morning, but it's all about focus. And, when you're working with a bunch of very smart people that, the privilege I have, you can spread yourself out quite thin. You can also prioritize things that's hot for that moment, but doesn't meet strategy. So making sure you have the strategy and you have that focus, it can help you scale.
So just on this one, and we'll touch on your career journey before we get to the main course about financial crime. I mean, I looked at your website like everybody's on my phone, on the train, blah, 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 big data, blah, 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 and all that kind of stuff, which I'm sure is very helpful. There's nothing wrong with your website, but like looking at everybody's sort of front page, you don't actually sort of understand anything in great detail. So just from a simple product or products perspective or service or services perspective, this is pretty stellar growth. I mean, there are not many fintechs that I can think of who in the space of 2.5 years ended up in 5, I was about to say countries around the world. I can't actually work out whether the countries, but anyway, 5 offices around the world, probably several countries. So what is it that you sell, in simple terms, to somebody who buys it, that's sold like hotcakes?
So the vision and the sell is actually very aligned here at Quantexa. So the reason why I started Quantexa was fundamentally the challenges that I was hearing from clients in my previous lives, where they were making decisions based upon a transaction or a limited view. Now, as humans, when we make a decision, we try to triangulate a lot of information to make a decision. So, for example, you're going to go and buy a house. When you buy a house, you would never look through the letterbox and go, I'm buying this house. Nobody does that.
No, I did something worse than that, actually. The house I liked the best, which I ended up having to give away because of the way life goes, I looked at it from the outside. I thought, that's the one for me. It was kind of love at first sight. So I didn't even look through the letterbox, actually.
Wow.
But anyway, once I got through the letterbox or through the front door, it was very nice inside as well, actually. But anyway, I see where you're coming from a business perspective.
Yeah.
No one looks at the world map and goes, we'll have an office in Delhi, without any data on whether it's Delhi or Mumbai or Bangalore. Or...
Coming back to sort of the vision piece, so you never buy a house by looking through the letterbox. You would open the door, look around in the house, look at the kitchen, look at the bathroom, go upstairs, look at the bedrooms. You then come back and then you look at the neighborhood, you look at the schools, you may look at the common, the coffee shops, the restaurants, and then you make a decision. Yes, I'm going to put an offer. But that's the same thing when it comes down to pretty much anything in life. So if it's financial crime, why would you try to mitigate and manage financial crime by looking at just one customer or just one transaction and say, I'm going to make a decision. You are a fraudster. I'm going to shut your account down. You never do that. So the whole thing about the vision was about building context by using all data as you can get and building context. To answer your question directly, the reason why we've been so successful is the technology that we have built allows customers, end users, to build context in real time so they can make a better decision.
And so you sell products or services or products/services?
No, we are a product company. We sell technology.
So if I buy your stuff,
Yeah.
I will get some software system-y thing on my computers.
Correct. And then you could use some of our partners. You mentioned Synchron earlier, who are one of our strategic partners. You could use Synchron to implement the software in your infrastructure or any of our other partners. We obviously do some of our implementations, of course, and sometimes they are hybrid teams between us and one of our partners and our clients. But we are a technology company. We've built a platform, we've built products, and we take that to market.
Okay, so that's nice and clear. Anyway, so we'll come back to Quantexa at the end, and you can wave your flag and you can just sell your products to thousands of people out there who can come and buy them. But coming on to the main course and getting our knife and fork out and the meat and 2 veg and potatoes. So let's start with a very simple one. Financial crime is a huge thing. So what does one mean by financial crime? What are the types of financial crime? And we've all got a vague idea of what finance is and what crime is, but what's the phrase financial crime mean in your world or when you're selling stuff to clients?
So financial crime could be things from money laundering, fraud, sanctions, anti-bribery and corruption. These could all be elements, and the combination would be financial crime. If we look in the world today from human trafficking to terrorism activity, etc., they are all involved with some form of money. There's money has been moved to sponsor an event that has had some form of terrorist activity. There's money being compromised from somebody's account, which is then being used to bring people for sex trafficking. At the end of the day, it's about money movement. Financial crime could be any section within fraud, AML, sanctions, and so on, makes up financial crime.
Okay, so I'm just trying to wonder how on earth I would start to approach this if I was a bank from first principles. So let me say I am a bank for the sake of argument, and I've got 1 million customers for the sake of argument, and they've got money in their accounts. Let's say every day they make an average of 20 transactions, so there's 20 million
Exactly.
financial flows going around. To ask a simple and very big picture question, how the bloody hell do I know which are kosher and which are not kosher, which are crime and which are not crime, and which are something in the middle? I mean, just going back to base data that your systems will need. How does that work? How do you know who the good guys are and bad guys are? Are there lists or something?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And before I even start to approach the answer to that question, but taking a step back, I would almost even add a few more complexities. So let's say you are a bank, like you say, but you're a bank that's evolved through acquisition. So your data now, as you say, you've got 1 million customers in your previous bank, you now got 5 million customers. Those customers have all come from different systems. They've been onboarded by different systems. So even knowing that this Vishal Marria that banked with Bank A and this Vishal Kumar Marria that's banked with Bank B, it's actually the same Vishal Marria. It's even a challenge. Also, when you are onboarding clients, there is so much information that you would know about your customer from your own data. But what about all the external data? What does the external world know about Vishal Marria? You know, there are lists of information like company data. In the UK, we have company house information where you can find out pretty much any company in the UK, the director's information and so on. That's information. So you're spot on with the point, you know, you've got 1 million customers, 1,000 transactions a day per customer or whatever the stat is. You're looking at millions and billions of records of data, both internal and external. And the challenge for the bank, as you correctly say, which is a genuine good transaction, and which is a transaction that's about to support a terrorist attack in the UK. How do you find that?
Well, it's a very good question insofar as, sadly, and I was thinking about this the other day actually, when I was young, terrorists were busy blowing up Birmingham pubs in the evening, which worried my parents no end, and now, sadly, we've had quite a few terrorists in London in recent years, and if the people whose full-time job is to track down terrorists can't spot the terrorists, I'm not quite sure if I was, for the sake of argument, Barclays or HSBC, how I'm supposed to spot them. I'm just being very naive about this.
It is a hard problem, full stop, right? The challenge we just said, there's billions of records. Yes, last year was a very unfortunate year. There was a number of events that happened in the UK, and it was sad. A lot of people got hurt, a lot of people lost their lives, and it was a very bad year. However, not a lot of people do know of this, but how many events were prevented over the last 10, 15 years, maybe 20 years? Obviously, you don't know that. And as a Londoner coming into work every day from London, where I was born, brought up, educated, knowing that, there are people who are watching out behind us to ensure these events don't happen. It's a great thing.
Interestingly enough, it just occurs to me that if we did know the number, it would presumably, whatever the number was, be bad. So if we had James Bond, actually James Bond was MI6 rather than MI5, but if we had an MI5 PC plod turn up and say, actually guys, I can tell you, but don't tell anybody else, it was 1 million. I go, bloody hell, 1 million, Jesus. That would worry me.
Of course.
But also, if they said, actually, we've prevented none, that would worry me too, because I think you're useless. So actually, there's no number that we could actually know about that which would make us happy. Now, maybe we shouldn't focus too much on the terrorism thing, which, because although it's terrible, it's one extreme. At the other end, we've got simple things like fraud and card holder not present on credit cards and much more sort of, mundane type of things.
Yeah. Well, I'll give you another typology within fraud. So yes, a card holder not present is one type. But I'll give you another one, which is probably the biggest type of fraud, but sometimes it's not necessarily categorized as fraud. It could be categorized as bad debt or credit risk even. The typologies could be called things like first-party fraud or sleeper fraud. And this is where customers open up the account with the sole intention to defraud the bank. So this could be, for example, I manipulate my information, or I've taken over somebody's ID and manipulated
My
it.
ex-wife had that. Someone managed to open an account in her name and that kind of stuff. And quite some time ago, I was sitting at a dinner next to somebody who had had a 250 grand mortgage taken out in his name and spent 5 years trying to clear his name.
And these things happen. And if you look at that loss, it actually will be a lot higher than some of those other losses, like CMP, for example, where you are seeing people either take over an ID or create fictitious IDs, open up a range of accounts, run them as normal, quotes unquote, run them as normal as they can, get as much unsecured lending as they can, and then eventually bust out, called bust out fraud. And this problem is global. Now, what I've seen in my experiences here, sometimes the defenses on the onboarding can be quite weak. Where banks are trying to grow their footprint, they will say, well, look, we'll take on that risk and try to manage it with the controls. But these are fraudsters, or these people don't exist. So when you send your collections people to knock on the door and actually the person never exists, it's very hard to collect money for someone who never existed. It's a very hard thing to do. So yes, absolutely, financial crime, fraud, absolutely. And under fraud, there are a range of types. And sleeper fraud or bust-out fraud or first-party fraud, this one, actually in the UK specifically, it's a big problem.
Do we have any numbers on fraud in the UK? I mean, I think I did see a while ago some stats around credit cards or something like that, and it was quite high, or percentages or something. Maybe there isn't such a number, but let's say of banking transactions, is it sort of a millionth of a percent that's sort of fraudulent, or 1%, or of credit cards, I've forgotten, is it 2, 3, 4%-ish, ballpark?
So you're looking at a couple of percent
right.
of transactions could be some form of fraud.
Which is a hell of a lot.
Absolutely. And this, again, just to be clear, this could be the credit risk side of fraud as well as pure fraud. So it can be quite a wide range. But the challenge is it's on the up. The more you dig, the more you find, the more you look, especially when I'm coming back to this first party bust out. You know, the stat I remember one institution said was anything between 10 to 20% of their total credit loss could be bust out fraud or sleeper fraud. That's a big number.
Just be careful, listeners. Bust out and sleeper fraud are which type again?
It's when you take the account out with the intention to not pay that loan or unsecured loan back. So it's not your can't pay, it's your won't pay. This is people who will not pay you back.
Right. I've got friends like that I lend books to. I lend books to loads of people, promptly forget about a year later who I lent it to, and then sort of 10 years later I'm looking for a book and I don't have it and I've got no idea who I lent it to, and they haven't returned it to me, but maybe your software doesn't cover that. Now, let's give some recent examples just to put some sort of flesh on the bones of publicly available information. I do recall something around Danske Bank, but I don't recall what I don't recall, as it were.
This was in the press, and it's hit, and it's continued on. A couple of weeks back, it was hit in a few articles about the CEO resigning at Danske Bank for potential movement of, at that point, millions of pounds through money laundering. That number's now become bigger. It's around 200, and it might become even bigger and bigger and bigger. So who knows? Now, obviously, Danske, and again, it's all in the press. They're not the only bank involved. Obviously, money movement requires two parties. Danske was involved and it was in the press around this, but there are other banks that have been involved in this, and that's listed. But there's another challenge, which is mirror trading. And again, publicly, a few years back, Deutsche Bank had a challenge around mirror trading in Russia.
And mirror trading is?
Mirror trading very much is where you book something under a security in one part of the world, you then do an FX transaction on another side of the world, and you fundamentally could have moved money to the bank and then from another part of the bank to another bank. So you're moving money, say, in Russia, and you're booking to a securities, and then you're doing a massive transaction out of London to the US where you're moving the same funds. So you've used the bank to launder your money. And it's a big problem. And, Deutsche had a known case a few years back. In the news this weekend, Danske also had a challenge around mirror trading as well.
Okay, and I can't think of any off the top of my head, but obviously this affects fintech as well, because I know over the years I've spoken to people and, they have to spend a lot of time trying to prevent fraud themselves and a lot of expense. I'm not sure any of that's actually public in terms of things that have been hit. So what's the penalty for not getting this right? I mean, obviously, as you mentioned, in this particular case, the CEO went and there'll be huge fines and sort of beating some regulators and loss of money and all sorts of terrible things like that.
Yeah, no, all of the above. I mean, let's quickly just rattle through this, right? So first and foremost, there is a fine. So if you look at HSBC, they had a major fine in its billions for their challenges they had with Mexico. Now, the other challenge with obviously the HSBC went through was a deferred prosecution agreement. And off the back of the DPA, they had to onboard a monitor to support the bank in going through the transformation within financial crime, which they exited last year.
And the DPA, the Deferred Prosecution Agreement, is presumably something with an American regulator that said, look, we'll keep our eye on you, and if you sort it, we won't beat you heavily with a stick, but if you don't, we'll really give you another beating.
Yeah, and we got people there that's looking at it.
Right, we've got people on the inside.
Yeah, kind of, yeah. So that is a costly program as well for the bank. So one is you get the fine.
And was the Mexico, I've forgotten, but was the Mexico an example where they did an acquisition in the past abroad?
That was one of the challenges, yes.
Yeah, so they bought in stuff, didn't fully integrate, didn't fully understand.
Yes.
Which is a non-trivial thing. If you're buying vast organisations, you know, it's not like acquiring me. If you acquire me, it won't take you very long to sort of go over the whole business.
Absolutely.
But if you've got a vast organisation, that's easier said than done.
Just ratting through the penalties. So one is a fine, first and foremost. Then you could end up having these things like deferred prosecution agreements, which basically means you've got a monitor. Standard Chartered is another bank who's had a monitor and so on. So that is a cost. That's an absolute cost to the organisation. And, you know, in certain cases, it could be so hard that, you know, it could cause a bank to go down just on the fine itself.
As BCCI did back in the day, as I recall.
BCCI was one of those banks that was set up in a very awkward position to do these type of things, right? And that's when they went down as well.
And also at the time, it's quite some time ago, and the Bank of England closed them down, but it's quite some time ago. But as I recall, the narrative at the time, or the insight track at the time, was that the Bank of England had been asked to keep it open so that MI5 and MI6 and all that lot could actually track these flows of money. Because perversely, from their perspective, if you're on that kind of secret intelligence side, actually there is an argument in which case you actually want to find out who is dealing with who and what's going on and all that kind of stuff, and therefore you keep it running. So it's certainly a nuanced thing. And going back to Standard Chartered, I always think there's something of a political angle to that one, because I remember that they took a robust attitude to the US regulator. I've forgotten, it was something around dealings with Iran or something like that, and they basically tried, which you don't do when America is the global imperial leader, they tried saying, it's none of your business. We're in London and they were in Persia or in Iran or whatever, which that doesn't work, because there was a tiny thing that went through the US. And I did read a good definition the other day of sanctions, which is, it won't be one that you use in your business or with your clients, but it is sanctions are a form of economic warfare. Yeah. Sanctions are something decided by the imperial top dog, whoever it was, America now or Britain 100 years ago or something, and the top dog says, thou shalt not so-and-so. So, for example, all the, quote, sanctions and all that kind of stuff around Russia, there's an argument which is that these are just political because, quotes, America doesn't like Russia and all that kind of stuff. So it gets into a murky area. Nevertheless, if you're a bank or if you're a vendor, it's really relatively simple. These are the rules. You don't have to argue about why they're there or whatever. They are the rules. You may love them, you may not love them. Some of them will be terrible, like sex trafficking and human trafficking. Other of them will be credit and fraud. It's a grey area. Another of them will just be, no, you're not allowed to make those kind of transfers. I'm sorry, Standard Chartered. In a way, I hear what you say, but no, this is what the law says.
Absolutely. But the challenge also comes when those regulations and lists conflict with one another. So if you are a global bank, like an HSBC, a Standard Chartered, a Citi, a JP Morgan, and so on, you have to look to multiple regulators. If it's MAS to HKMA to FCA and SEC, OCC.
All of whom will have slightly different definitions of what's a crime and what's not a crime in a way.
And also certain lists will be different. We talk about OFAC being a list, obviously is the main.
So OFAC
is the US sanctions list, fundamentally. And they have a list of countries to not trade with. That could be different to other lists. So it can be a challenge for banks. That's why you would have regional or country MLROs, money laundering risk officers, who will report into that country to make sure that that entity within that bank is abiding to those regulations for that country. But then you've got, the global MLRO, which is going to look at it from the holistic. That's why technology plays a part to fixing this problem, but having the policy and the process in place is also very critical, because if one of those policies conflict between countries, which one wins? And sometimes it could be which one doesn't give you the bigger fine.
Exactly. So the American one wins. But you make a very good point there, and you make me very glad I'm a podcaster and not involved in all that kind of crap. It didn't really used to exist so much back in the day. I mean, of course, fraud has always existed, and thieves have always existed, and all that kind of stuff. But sanctions didn't used to be such a big thing. In fact, I don't think there were any 30 years ago. And just picking up on one point there, because it is a pertinent and it's easily forgotten, as you said, global bank. And that's a phrase used all the time by the FT and all that kind of stuff. But in a way, as Nigel Verdon touched on when he was on the show some time ago, there is actually no such thing as a global bank. If you're talking about Citigroup or HSBC or whatever, in terms of the thing that's listed on a stock exchange, it is, in a sense, an umbrella company which owns a whole host of subsidiaries or basically other companies in countries which are regulated and incorporated in that country. It is a sort of an agglomeration of a whole bunch of different businesses, which hence means that the issues you talk about are far greater than people who aren't involved in them may think. It's not like it's one thing which is spread around the world. No, it is many things joined together. It's a bit like, I don't know how Ernst & Young is quite structured these days, but Ernst & Young isn't one, should we say, PLC, which has got branches everywhere. It's goodness knows how many partnerships or firms or LLPs or whatever they are.
Correct. You're absolutely right. And it's hard. It's hard to manage and it's hard to, stitch up. But sorry, coming back to the penalty side. So I mentioned a few. The other penalty, and especially coming back to the US here, is if you don't do X, Y, or Z, you cannot clear US dollars. Now that's a penalty in its own right. So if you say you cannot clear US dollars, everything ends up going via US dollars somewhere. And now you're not allowed to...
This is how they call it Standard Chartered, isn't it? Which is that, as you say, you've got to touch dollars at some point.
You've got to touch dollars somewhere. So even though you may be a large Middle Eastern bank and all of your customers are domiciled in the Middle East, if you are going to clear US dollars, you shall be compliant to my regulations. So you've got to be careful there. So you've got the fines, you've got the monitorships that you have to manage for a period of time, 3, 5, 7 years or whatever the penalty was. You've got the whole thing about the dollar clearing issue with the US. But the other thing is reputational damage.
Yes. It didn't help Standard Chartered being on the front page, the FT for ages, bang, regardless of whether they were right or wrong or something in the middle or percentage-wise this or that.
And Standard Chartered have put a lot of investment behind fixing this problem. They have. So has HSBC. They've put substantial investment behind fixing the challenges they've gone through. But the reputational damage is also hard, right? These things, case studies, fines, DPAs, etc. This is something that probably won't go away for at least a generation, right? And that's a reputational piece. Now, obviously, a lot of banks are putting a lot of investment as well around changing its perception. And Standard Chartered, even on their main website, they have a section around anti-financial crime and the process that they're put in place for anti-financial, which is fantastic. So the training and the education and all of that piece is going down really well, and they're doing a tremendous job. Same thing with HSBC. They did exactly the same process. But again, all I would say, coming back to penalties, that reputational penalty as well, which it might not be immediate, but it does have a longer consequence.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a nightmare. I mean, I mentioned it before in the podcast, but in the 1990s, one of the things that used to concern us most at Client Watts was reputational damage. We'd rather lose a few quid than something of the reputation, because if you've lost the reputation, it takes a long time to get it back. And just thinking, I mean, I'm beating up on America, why not? But actually, one should also start beating up on the EU in this case. Things like GDPR reach quite far. And I was listening to the Marketing Companion podcast recently in America, and they were super stressed over some latest thing where EU is taking Google to court on not just eliminating search results in Europe, but around the world or something. The right to be forgotten is now. So there's whole extraterritoriality over these people sort of fighting it. Right, okay, so I'm kind of getting the feel of answering my own question at the beginning, which is, have you grown so fast in 2.5 years? Because the sales pitch, and I paraphrase it, and you probably don't use these precise words when you go into a meeting, is, God, if this goes wrong, it'll be a bloody disaster, mate. You really need to buy some shit and sort this out. And you tell them about the fines. Oh, bloody, yeah, Christ. I'll have 10, I'll have half a dozen kind of stuff. So joking apart, it's super important. And if you get the right tools, I mean, I haven't looked at all your systems and that kind of stuff, so I don't know whether yours are the right one, but clearly a lot of people think they are because you're growing rapidly. It's a absolutely must do, and we all hear of big data so much we get a bit bored and blasé about it, but it's a prime example where you absolutely need people who are experts looking for needles in haystacks and saying, excuse me, so I'm not sure whether it's a straw or a needle, but maybe you check it out if it's a straw or a needle. So in general, people can obviously buy your systems or somebody else's systems, and then sort of no doubt there's a bit of an ecosystem and people and processes around it, as you mentioned. I mean, how do you sort of make that more precise rather than waffly, as I did?
As you say, and as I said before, it is an ecosystem, right? You need to get your risk assessment accurate, you need to get your policy in place, your processes in place, your training in place. But technology plays a major part. It's not the only part, but it plays a major part. Now, the words AI, machine learning, big data, big analytics, RPA, robotic process automation, etc., are used so much in the industry. I mean, if you don't hear it in a day in tech, you're not in tech.
I always fall asleep when I hear it these days, actually.
Yeah. So in my view, it's about combining human intelligence with machine intelligence. Bringing that together is the ecosystem of being more effective and efficient in managing your financial crime. Now, obviously, if you want to manage your financial crime and money was not an issue, you would look at every single customer and every single transaction by a human, and then you do that. So you will recruit an army of people and look at every transaction that is made. You call up every customer and say, was this your transaction? And validate. Now, obviously, you cannot do that.
Because you would lose all your business and you would charge too much in the first place.
Correct. Game over. So you've got to be smarter. So you've got to be more efficient. You've got to be more effective. You've got to make sure you have that technology and the other components, as I mentioned, all working together in an ecosystem to manage your risk most effectively.
And pressing pause on that, what's the regulator's position on this? Because whenever somebody cocks it up, at least the stuff that comes into the media, you see the regulator beating the crap out of the bank. Now, the only way to have 100% success at stopping fraud is, as you say, is to employ a person per transaction or something like that. And even then they will make mistakes.
Absolutely.
So I think credit cards are a bit more grown up about this because they've been around for decades. But presumably if you're a credit card business, you go, the average rate of credit card fraud is 4% and ours is 2.5%, so we're doing quite well. But you don't try and reduce it to zero. Is there a sort of challenge here that some regulators in some perspectives kind of are a bit ivory tower and think your error rate should be zero, but it can't be zero because it'd be infinitely costly? Things go wrong in life.
Absolutely. And I think this is where, in certain countries in the world, there is better collaboration between the private sector and the regulators. In the UK, there's a lot of great initiatives around this, around communicating with the FCA, banks sitting down, going through this, and the regulators, especially I would say here in the UK, they are open to new innovative ideas in managing their risk. They know how difficult this is for the challenge that we've already mentioned. So the regulators are open for that conversation. The key thing here, Mike, is transparency. How do you document and how do you prove that you looked at the right set of transactions of customers, that you didn't look at this population of customers for these reasons? How do you validate that? How do you apply that transparency in your documentation of the controls you've got in place? And this is the typical model validation, model governance that large organizations, large banks have to prove to the regulator what we did. But it's definitely better collaboration now, and there's more collaboration between the private sector and the regulators. I think that's getting better. Obviously, there's still a lot of work to do. But as I say, it is that ecosystem. You need to have the best of breed ecosystem, which is going to manage data analytics, plus scenarios and rules, plus machine learning techniques and human intelligence, and bringing that all together to be the most effective. And I talk about two sort of ways. One is design time. So when you're designing the solution, putting all of that machine learning capability together and understanding those patterns in the data that looks like financial crime. And then you look at the runtime, is then taking the design time and putting it into production and then running that through with all its governance. So it is definitely an eco.
Good. Okay. And just to make it clear, we've spoken about big banks, but anybody who is in finance, app banks or peer-to-peers or something, must spend a lot of time on this.
And fintechs.
Exactly, fintechs. Even if there were no regulators, even if there were no variable rules around the world or everything like that, fintechs who are involved in money would have to do this anyway.
So let's talk about Facebook. If Facebook suddenly starts doing payments and they switch strategy to move money, they will become one of the biggest, if not the biggest payments provider in the world overnight with the number of accounts they have. So even they will need this regulation.
Exactly. So it hits everybody. So I've got an understanding of the magnitude. I've got an understanding of the complexity. I'm really glad I'm not involved in the area myself because it sounds super complex, although if I was sort of decades younger, it might be a fascinating one. Where's all this sort of roughly going without using things like sort of MI will take over the world and, a computer will run it in a corner and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah. So I think more banks, more large, small fintechs, as we just discussed, will be putting in more controls in a much more open and transparent way of managing their risk. They will start, as I said earlier, there will be more collaboration between the private sector and the regulators and the feedback loop from the regulators back to the private sector. That's definitely something. But what I would also say, sharing of best practice and data and so on. So for example, in the US, they have this initiative called 314B where they can share some of this intelligence. There is no substitute of sharing information where you can do it in a secure, transparent way with all its right privacy, but sharing criminal information and so on will make you more effective. If someone's bad in my bank and I shut them down, they're not going to disappear. They're going to go somewhere else. So that typical squash balloon effect, you squeeze them here, they'll come out there, actually applies in this space.
Yes, and I'm sure there's a gap in the fintech market for somebody who would be a trusted provider who anonymizes all the various things that are happening in various places and shares that kind of stuff. I mean, I'm thinking of aircrafts where there was at some point in time a system, and it still applies, I think, for pilots to be able to report any issues or something like that they've had with airplanes, all this kind of stuff, anonymously or whatever. And that database of, I saw Air Crash Investigates last night. There was some A330 Airbus, and they'd had 3 incidents off the west coast of Australia, which is really bizarre and nowhere else, where suddenly it pitched down 15 degrees and the autopilot wouldn't respond to the pilot. Absolute bloody nightmare. And they, in one, several people were seriously injured, broken stuff, All my listeners who are on an aeroplane soon, keep your seatbelt on. It's very important. And again, there is now a system where people sort of talk about that stuff rather than trying to cover it up. So it's a huge area. I wouldn't advise any of my people listening, please don't get into financial crime. If you want a topic, however, that's never going to go away and you need a job, maybe you should get a job in working in this area, because the more the world integrates with different regulators, with different companies around, the more complex it gets. And we're all a bit bored of hearing big data, but this is a practical example of where one needs to leverage it and get answers out of it. So before we wrap up the show, I'd like to thank all the listeners out there. I hope none of you have been victims of financial crime recently. It's no fun. And my brand partners for the podcast, Blue Motor Finance, who are, according to the 2018 FT1000, the fastest growing FS business in Europe. Blue's award-winning technology has supported over $1 billion of lending, working with over 3,700 UK motor retailers. Smart Pension, who are fast, secure and free. Check out their UK workplace pensions at autoenrolment.co.uk. So we've covered quite a lot, and I think people got a sort of idea that you sell products and all that kind of stuff, and if they're trying to fight financial crime, they should check you out. But more broadly, Vish, what breadcrumbs do you want to throw on the waters for several million fishes?
Thank you. So, context. If you would like to understand your customer, if it's for financial crime or outside of financial crime for customer intelligence, contextual monitoring is the way forward. Being able to build that view of your customer across internal and external data and accurately finding those needles in those haystacks, if it's coming down to financial crime, for example, that is something our business is thriving at the moment. Open architecture, leveraging the best of breed of data analytics to provide that contextual view is reason why I created Quantexa. And all I would say, if you are looking for technology around contextual monitoring, please come to the website.
Excellent. Well, it's a super important topic, and I'm really pleased to hear that you've grown very rapidly. And if I was forming a fintech tomorrow, I would definitely want someone who's going to sort this out for me, because it's bad enough creating a business out of thin air and actually delivering your product and looking after your customers without, as it were, having to build the walls of a castle and the moat around the castle and have somebody policing the drawbridge. So people to cope with that angle, it's a very good delegation. I'm a great fan of the idea that you build a good business by sticking to what you're good at and delegating the other stuff like, I don't know, making sandwiches at lunch or the coffee to people who are better. So thanks for that, Vish, and I wish you every success in the future.
Thank you, Mike.
Thanks for listening. If you have consulting, advisory/non-exec or media needs in the FS or fintech space, get in touch with me at mike@londonfintechpodcast.com.
We could say watching the firelight dance, watching the firelight dance. We could walk in the mountains before dawn, watching a happy moon ride, watching a happy moon ride. Come away from the city, with the tarmac so dead and the people so sad. Come away from the city, with the faces so grey, with the pain of the everyday. We are wild like the mountains and the trees. Can you see what I mean? Can you see what I mean? We fit in between the earth and the sky. Kiss the city goodbye, wave the city goodbye, wave the city goodbye, the city goodbye. Watch the firelight dance with me, 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 watch the firelight dance.